So essentially what I have here on the table right now is a straightforward set of comics that are in need of pressing. I didn't want to do anything too complicated. I wanted to keep it relatively straightforward for the purpose of this demonstration, and maybe in future videos we can do something a little more complex. But to this point, what I've tried to do is to pull together, I think it's 6 comics here that are, or 5 comics that are relatively easy to press. So on the far left, we basically have Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 95. This is a book that just came out recently. It is the first appearance of the first female Ninja Turtle. And these books are fresh off the press, but I'll show you why they actually still need to be pressed even though they are brand new comics. Next to that, I have 2 copies of The Walking Dead. This is the Rick Grimes tribute. And again, here I'll show you why these books, even though new, still need to be pressed. And on the far right, I actually have a really nice copy of Uncanny X-Men number 98. And this is an underrated book in my opinion. And it's underrated because in this book, we actually find out that Wolverine's claws are actually part of his physique. Prior to this, it was assumed that they were built into his gloves or something like that. But in this book, we find out that they are actually part of him. And that's what makes this book really cool. I actually just picked this one up basically at the same time I picked these others up. So I thought it was a good time to actually press a couple of books that don't have crazy defects like spine rolls and things like that. These are relatively straightforward. And so in this first part of the video, what I want to do is I want to show you some of the pressable defects that we are going to attempt to correct through the pressing process. Now, one of the challenges is that with video, it is sometimes difficult for the video to pick up all of the defects that may be seen with the naked eye, but I'm going to do my best using the lighting here in the room to show you some of these pressable defects that will hopefully not be present after we go through the pressing process. And you can see that I have my moisture bath all set. So I want to show you these books, and then I'm actually going to then put these books into the moisture bath, expose them to moisture, and then what you'll see after this is basically the books being pressed and then coming out of the press. That's basically how hopefully this video is going to unfold. So let me go ahead and show you what's going on with each one of these books. And again, as best I can, I'm going to demonstrate some of the defects that I'm actually seeing. So as you can see here on the cover of this book, there is definitely some rippling that's happening. And it's basically down the entire book, right? These are modern books, new books that literally came off the press not that long ago, but you can still see that there is some rippling to this book. And again, that's part of what we are going to attempt to correct through the pressing process. You can see some of those similar rippling effects on the back cover as well. So definitely on the front cover and the back cover. I'm actually not going to show you what the second book looks like because the second book actually has the exact same defects as the first. What I can tell you is that the top book in each one of these stacks is probably a 9.8 candidate with a press. The second book in each stack is probably not a 9.8 unless CGC makes some allowances for certain defects like bindery tears. And in the case of this book in particular, this one actually has a spine tick on the back side, and I think this one has a little bit of a bindery tear. And so the second books in both stacks probably will not go to CGC unless I hear that they are making allowances for those bindery tears, which they have done in the past. I just want to make sure that they're not going to do something a little bit different for these particular books. But now let me go ahead and show you the defects with the Walking Dead book. So you can actually see quite clearly there the exact same effect that we saw with the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles book. A little bit of some warping, a little bit of some rippling goes all the way down the book. And both this copy and that copy basically have the exact same types of defects, and this is exactly what we are going to correct through the pressing process. And again, this book is in pretty solid shape. I mean, this is probably a 9.8 easy, and rest assured I've actually washed my hands right before doing this video, so I don't feel bad about touching it, but this is probably a 9.8 with a press. The second one maybe not, depending upon what CGC decides to do. Now let's go ahead and take a look at the Uncanny X-Men 98. And what you'll notice is that this book definitely has some additional wear and tear on it. It is not a modern comic. It has some defects. So with this book, you don't see the warping, but you can definitely see over where Storm's face is. There is a crease right there. There's a couple of little creases, folds, and dings on the book. You can see some of it on the right-hand side. If you look down in the right-hand corner, there is a tear actually above the R in Marvel. Not much we can do about that, but there is definitely some creasing across the top that you can probably see. And again, these are all things that we should be able to either eliminate or improve the appearance of with a press. Now, the backside of this book is actually in decent shape. It's actually pretty white on the backside, but even back here, you can see that there are definitely some defects on the back cover. This back cover has been cleaned, but there are definitely some creases, some dings, some folds that are happening back here that, again, should be able to be corrected or at least improved with the pressing process. Now, as I mentioned in some of the previous videos, and if you haven't watched those, I definitely want to encourage you to go back and watch those. What I'll probably do for these first two stacks of books is I'll probably just shoot one of the backing boards right in the middle, right at the center folds of each one of these books here. And then I will insert additional Teflon sheets periodically throughout the books to prevent them from sticking. Because with the modern books, you definitely have a different type of paper, you have a different type of ink, and these books will stick together. There's no doubt about that. Those pages, because of the heat, because of the moisture, will stick together. So I'll use some Teflon sheets to actually help prevent those from sticking together as they go into the pressing process. Now, with this one, the Uncanny X-Men 98, this book has different paper than what you will see with these modern books. And what I'm going to end up doing with this book, because it has pressable defects on both the front and back cover, it needs a slightly different treatment than does these two books over here, these two stacks. What I'm going to do for this one is I'm actually going to insert a backing board in the front, behind the front cover and behind the back cover, because that'll give me a nice amount of pressure on this book to hopefully be able to flatten out the defects that we just saw a few moments ago. So that's one of the big differences in how you would treat, or at least how I treat, a modern comic from an older comic that has some defects that can't easily be corrected with just a simple backing board and just a quick press, right? Much of what we are seeing will actually be improved through the pressing process. So as I mentioned earlier, what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to put all of these books into a moisture bath. I'll leave them in there for about 4 to 6 hours. Then I'm going to take them out, and then I'm actually going to put them in the press, and hopefully I'll be able to actually show you that, how I set them up. But we're going to basically put them in a press. We're going to leave them in there for, about 6 hours. Then we're going to take them out, and we're going to do the same thing that we just did here. We're going to try to examine these books. I'm going to show you how they look once they've come out of the press, and hopefully what we'll be seeing are some major improvements. So definitely stay tuned for that. All right, so now I want to go ahead and press a couple of comics for you. So the comics that are sitting off to the left-hand side here have actually been in the moisture bath for several hours, and they are definitely ready to come out of the moisture bath, and they're ready to be pressed. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull them out individually, 2 comics, and then I'm going to get them set up inside of the press here. And as best I can, I'm going to show you the setup. It may be a little bit hard for you to see everything just because of the configuration that I have here in the room. So I also want to describe it as best I can. So for the first book, the Uncanny X-Men book that we spoke about before, what I'll basically be doing is inserting a Golden Age backing board just behind the front cover and then just behind the back cover. And that's going to allow me to press out the defects on the front and the back cover. That's essentially all that I'm going to do for that comic. For the modern comic, that is below it, it'll probably be the Walking Dead book. What I'll do for that book is I'm actually going to use some additional copies of the Teflon paper to insert every couple of pages in that comic. And the reason for that is to ensure that the comic doesn't stick. Because the book is basically black and white, it doesn't require as many Teflon sheets, but I'm going to kind of stick a couple in there so you can kind of see how I go ahead and orient those in there. The modern comic, the Walking Dead book, is only going to actually get one backing board right at the very center. It doesn't have the types of defects that you can actually see or would have seen previously with the Uncanny X-Men book. So those will be the major differences between how I set these two books up. But I basically go through this thing. I'll drop both into the press. We're going to turn the press on, and then we're going to start the pressing process. And then after that, you will see the results of the books as they come out of the press. What you can see here is that this book definitely has some additional kind of warping and ripples to the page versus how we looked at it previously. The book definitely has been in the moisture bath the right amount of time, because you can see the pages kind of curl up at the very edge there. This book is definitely ready to be pressed. So what you may have noticed that I was trying to do there was to ensure that the backing board matte finish side was actually in contact with the front and back covers. So that was one thing that I was trying to ensure of. And then as I inserted the backing boards into the comic, what I wanted to do was to make sure that they were nestled all the way up into the comic, all the way down to, where the spine is, because the last thing you want to do is to basically press the book and then have a little bit of a gap here on the very edge where your backing board didn't go all the way to the spine of the book, and then you basically have pressed into the book basically a defect. And so that's what I was trying to do, was to bump the backing board down so that it was flush against that spine to prevent me from, again, pressing a defect into the comic. Alright, so as you saw there with the Walking Dead book, I took a little bit of extra time with this one to insert a couple of additional Teflon sheets inside the book. Just inside the back cover, just inside the front cover, periodically throughout the book, and then again stuck the backing board into the very middle of the book, right at the center folds. And in all cases, I tried to tap all of those things down to make sure that they were flush in contact with the spine, again, to prevent any kind of gaps or to prevent any kind of pressable defects to be inserted into the comic. And then the very last thing you saw was me wipe the comic off to ensure that, again, there was nothing on the surface of the comic that could be pressed into the book to basically create a defect. And now that I've basically positioned both of the comics in here, I probably should have already done this. turn the temperature on, turn the press on so that it can actually heat up to the proper temperature. And once it reaches 175 degrees, we will then collapse the top of the press here to start the timer for 25 seconds. So now that the comics are in there, the press has been turned on, I'm actually going to cover the comics up with 2 additional Teflon sheets, again, to give it some protection from this top plate, which is where the heat actually comes from. What you did not see in this video, but you definitely would have seen in previous videos, was what I have on the bottom here, which is basically an aluminum plate that has been cut to basically the size of the bottom of the press here, and aluminum conducts heat. So yeah, there's a lot of heat that comes out of this top plate, and it kind of goes through the book. The aluminum plate down at the bottom also heats up, definitely not to the temperature of the top, but enough to basically press out a lot of the defects on the bottom of the book. So between the heat and the pressure on the comic, it seems to be enough to actually press out most defects. With the Uncanny X-Men book, there are actually defects in the top and the bottom, the front cover and the back cover. And so what we'll have to do is when the comic actually comes out of there, we'll have to examine it to see whether all of the defects have been pressed out or whether we need to press the book an additional time. I've actually already pressed a copy of The Walking Dead, and so I know that because this is a modern book, because it doesn't have a lot of defects in the front and the back cover, I know that one press rotation is more than enough to remove the defects that we were able to see earlier in the book. We've now reached about 175 degrees. We're about 1 degree off, and it should click in just a moment as we reach 175. And then we're going to go ahead and collapse this thing down and start the clock. And what I'm going to be aiming for is about 6 hours on these two books. They were in the moisture bath a little longer than I normally do, but they've been in there for some time, and I want to make sure that we get all the moisture out. And also because that Uncanny X-Men book has some wear, we definitely want to take some additional time with that. So we're going to drop this thing, and the timer has begun. All right, so now that the timer's gone off, I basically turned it off. A lot of people like to unplug it, but I think turning it off is more than sufficient. So now it's time to open up the press and to check out what impact we've actually had on the comics that we placed in here a little over 6 hours ago. So I'm getting my first look here at the Uncanny X-Men book, and we're able to hopefully catch the light here. You can see that the appearance of this book has been dramatically improved by the pressing process. It looks incredible versus how it looked going into the press. You can see that there's definitely still that non-pressable defect above the R there in Marvel. But outside of that, the book appears to be pretty solid. So that's the front cover. We'll turn it over and take a look at the back. And again, same kind of impact on the back here. Definitely looking pretty good. I'll have to take a closer look at it, but I think that we can definitely call this one a success. So again, as we look at this book, you can see that it looks pretty darn good versus what it looked like when we first put it into the press. Definitely improved the overall appearance of this comic with just a little bit of work. So look at the back side of the book. Same as the front side, definitely looks pretty nice. You can see where my hand was actually holding the book a second ago, so that'll definitely come out in a couple of seconds. But book definitely looks pretty darn nice.